3. Europe murdered. Rumour spread by voice and radio throughout the world. An island had been mysteriously exploded. The American fleet had been mysteriously annihilated in the air, and in the neighbourhood where these events had occurred, distinguished scientists were gathered in conference. The European government sought out the unknown saviour of Europe to thank him and secure his process for their own use. The president of the Scientific Society gave an account of the meeting and the unanimous vote. He and his colleagues were promptly arrested, and pressure, first moral and then physical, was brought to bear on them to make them disclose the secret, for the world was convinced that they really knew it and were holding it back for their own purposes. Meanwhile, it was learnt that the American air commander, after he had defeated the European fleet, had been instructed merely to demonstrate above England while peace was negotiated. For in America, big business had threatened the government with boycott if unnecessary violence were committed in Europe. Big business was by now very largely international in sentiment, and it was realised that the destruction of Europe would inevitably unhinge American finance. But the unprecedented disaster to the victorious fleet roused the Americans to blind hate, and the peace party was submerged. Thus it turned out that the Chinaman's one hostile act had not saved England, but doomed her. For some days Europeans lived in dread panic, knowing not what horror might at any moment descend on them. No wonder then that the government resorted to torture in order to extract the secret from the scientists. No wonder that out of the 40 individuals concerned, one, the Englishman, saved himself by deceit. He promised to do his best to remember the intricate process. Under strict supervision, he used his own knowledge of physics to experiment in search of the Chinaman's trick. Fortunately, however, he was on the wrong scent, and indeed he knew it. For though his first motive was mere self-preservation, later he conceived the policy of indefinitely preventing the dangerous discovery by directing research along a blind alley. And so his treason, by seeming to give the authority of a most eminent physicist to a wholly barren line of research, saved this undisciplined and scarcely human race from destroying its planet. The American people sometimes tend even to excess, were now collectively insane with hate of the English and of all Europeans. With cold efficiency they flooded Europe with the latest and deadliest of gases, till all the peoples were poisoned in their cities like rats in their holes. The gas employed was such that its potency would cease within 3 days. It was therefore possible for an American sanitary force to take charge of each metropolis within a week after the attack. Of those who first descended into the great silence of the murdered cities, many were unhinged by the overwhelming presence of the dead populations. The gas had operated first upon the ground level, but, rising like a tide, it had engulfed the top stories, the spires, the hills. Thus, while in the streets lay thousands who had been overcome by the first wave of poison, every roof and pinnacle bore the bodies of those who had struggled upward in the vain hope of escaping beyond the highest reach of the tide. When the invaders arrived, they beheld on every height prostrate and contorted figures. Thus Europe died. All centres of intellectual life were blotted out, and of the agricultural regions on the uplands and mountains were untouched. The spirit of Europe lived henceforth only in a piecemeal and dislocated manner in the minds of Americans, Chinese, Indians, and the rest. There were indeed the British colonies, but they were by now far less European than American. The war had, of course, disintegrated the British Empire. Canada sided with the United States. South Africa and India declared their neutrality at the outbreak of war. Australia, not through cowardice but through conflict of loyalties, was soon reduced to neutrality. The New Zealanders took to their mountains and maintained an insane but heroic resistance for a year. A simple and gallant folk, they had almost no conception of the European spirit, yet obscurely and in spite of their Americanisation, they were loyal to it, or at least to that symbol of one aspect of Europeanism, England. Indeed, so extravagantly loyal were they, or so innately dogged and opinionated, that when further resistance became impossible, many of them, both men and women, killed themselves rather than submit. But the most lasting agony of this war was suffered not by the defeated, but by the victors. For when their passion had cooled, the Americans could not easily disguise from themselves that they had committed murder. They were not at heart a brutal folk, but rather a kindly. They liked to think of the world as a place of innocent pleasure-seeking, and of themselves as the main purveyors of delight. Yet they had been somehow drawn into this fantastic crime, and henceforth an all-pervading sense of collective guilt warped the American mind. They had ever been vainglorious and intolerant, but now these qualities in them became extravagant even to insanity. Both as individuals and collectively, they became increasingly frightened of criticism, increasingly prone to blame and hate, increasingly self-righteous, increasingly hostile to the critical intelligence, increasingly superstitious. Thus was this once noble people singled out by the gods to be cursed, and the minister of curses.